All right, team, here is the lecture on Chapter 6, Ethical Principles Applied to Sport Management for Kinesiology 2314, Introduction to Sport Management. So this is always a very topical chapter. There's always things in the news that are going on that really help to flesh out all of the issues that sport managers come into contact on a daily basis, and how important sound ethical reasoning is, not just for sport managers but anyone in in the workplace. So, what are ethics? Well, ethics are, as the textbook says, a systematic study of the values guiding our decision making, and that they reflect how people should behave in specific situations and how we should operate. So, ethical reasoning really is the process of coming to what that person believes subjectively as a fair and correct decision based on the facts at hand. And there's a big distinction between the values or ethics of someone and the legal obligations that are imposed upon them by the law. So if you look to the gavel, that symbolizes the law. And the law is a set of statutes that have been debated upon by Congress or some sort of body that is supposed to represent our peers, our elected officials. And then those laws that are passed and enforced represent the baseline minimum standard that people in this society must adhere to. However, ethics usually go above and beyond what is expected by us, or that is thrust upon us by the law. So the values of an individual can impact their ethical reasoning individually based on their subjective beliefs. And then also the organizations that a person might work in also has collective ethics and values that are based upon foundational principles of the organization, usually set out in a mission statement, or the ethics, values, and beliefs of people who are at senior level positions. So let's talk about the difference between ethical dilemmas and decision makings. So an ethical dilemma means that there is some sort of conflict that is going on involving two equally compelling issues or values or obligations. And we are going to try to solve these issues by going through and articulating to ourselves what those values are that we admire the most. So, when we're talking about decision making from an ethical context, we're actually trying to work through our own beliefs based off of how the actions that we're debating on will affect other groups or people that are within the realm of our decision. So, for example, we've got a football and some generic drugs down there to symbolize an ethical topic that is always in vogue within sport management, and that is doping in sports. There are plenty of examples of ethical decision making when it comes to performance enhancing drugs, whether it's the Olympic Games, whether it's professional sport, amateur sport. It could be that gym rat that's at the local rec center who wants to get ripped very quickly and wants to do that in the shortest period of time. And the ethics of performance enhancing drugs are going to be impacted by our own individual beliefs, our values, and then those beliefs very well might impact the organization that is also trying to work through this ethical dilemma, and that decision needs to be made. So in a vacuum, Some people might say, hey, let everyone take as many drugs as they want. At least that way we know it's definitely on an even playing field because anyone can do whatever they want. Or versus, say, what is a more commonly held belief within professional leagues or within the Olympic Games, that there should be a baseline level of fairness where people are not forced to take drugs. So again, going back to our little example here with the law says bans certain types of drugs based off of the nature of those drugs. But for something like supplements or something that is not banned by the FDA but is available to the public, but might be banned by certain leagues. You got the wallet example on the right here. It's up to your values and your ethics, or the organization's values and ethics, in terms of how that decision is going to shake out. So morality is also something that's part of ethics because that really guides our behavior. And it usually, morality involves certain actions or activities that people should either refrain from doing or that they ought to do. You ought to be honest. You ought to not steal. You ought to work hard. You ought to abstain from violence. And then morals, as part of our ethical decision making, are based on the values that are dictated by society that as to what should be appropriate. So morality might be that you should not steal and should be honest, and then you should not commit a crime. And then morals is that society should act in a way that's fair to everybody, that people are not judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their heart, that people should not be taken advantage of. That might be amoral. And we have on the left and the right here examples of athletes who, in years before and more recently, really stood up for their own morals about how society should act, that people should be treated fairly, and that people should not be judged based on the color of their skin. And they demonstrated that, whether it was the Rams walking out of the tunnel with their hands up, simulating the hands up, don't shoot mantra that has been popularized in the last few years, or the iconic boxing champion, civil rights activist and advocate Muhammad Ali, who really sacrificed a great deal to bring to the forefront his beliefs and the beliefs of others about the inherent inequities within American life. So in terms of ethical considerations, again, as future sport managers or people working in recreation or in other aspects of sport, we need to understand the importance of ethics and knowing how to break things down and going through decision-making processes, because one, there are many diverse groups that have a connection to the sport management field. And because of that, because there's many different stakeholder groups, sport managers then face ethical dilemmas, oftentimes on a daily basis. It could be issues involving fans or the media or stakeholders in the community or the private community or the business community or some sort of public entity. It could be something nationally. And because of the fact that sport is often under an intense public microscope, the decisions and conduct of sport managers, as well as other individuals associated with that organization, are going to be magnified, and the consequences are going to be magnified. Therefore, proper ethical analysis really will help with mitigating or limiting the potential adverse consequences of the ethical decision-making process. It really falls under a systematic process of reasoning where the pros and cons of your choices are weighed and they are analyzed based off of the values by which your morality is either your morality or your ethics or any sort of fundamental element of your ethical reasoning is based on. So we've got several examples on the bottom here. Again, these athletes found a way to verbalize their beliefs in terms of how society should govern and how that people should not be judged and treated differently based solely by the color of their skin, that the morals of society should be colorblind. And so they demonstrated by wearing the I Can't Breathe t-shirts during pregame warm-ups. And then we have something more pronounced on the right where not from an individual standpoint, but from a league standpoint, NBA Commissioner David Stern, for all intents and purposes, banished Donald Sterling from the NBA as an owner after it became public that that he had beliefs that were seemingly racist, and he was summarily, after a brief due process, lost his rights to his franchise, the Los Angeles Clippers. It was a forced sale, and he vowed to sue until the day he died, but ultimately he lost these challenges, and just the whole series of events was very bizarre, involving the NBA and Donald Sterling. One thing of note, though, is that there were rumors that Sterling had exhibited these beliefs and had acted in this manner for years, and it was only until these recordings of him going on these racist rants that were surreptitiously recorded and then released to the public. It was only when these beliefs and rants became public did Adam Silver and the NBA actually do anything about it. So then that really leads to questions involving the genuineness of the NBA's actions. Something to consider. So when we're talking about the ethical decision-making process, because again, we're talking in the framework of ethical analysis, the systematic framework of reasoning. Holmes and McLean suggest a 11-part analysis, and this analysis is something that I will want you to go through as you try to understand ethics in sport. So the first aspect, or the first element, is identifying the correct problem to be solved. So what is the issue at hand? What is going on? So it could be something as simple as that your organization is going to be hosting an event in a state that has just passed some sort of legislation that your organization does not agree with, such as the bathroom law that was passed in North Carolina, and then NBA had the NBA All-Star Game scheduled for that year or upcoming year. Gather all the pertinent information. So try to do as much research as possible so that you or your organization can be put in the best position possible to make an informed decision. Explore codes of conduct relevant to your profession or to this particular dilemma. We'll talk about codes of conduct very shortly, but certainly codes of conduct can be helpful because they lay out guiding norms or beliefs that should help in walking through what is the appropriate decision to make. Examine your own personal beliefs and values. Hopefully the values and beliefs of your organization are something that you share yourself. Sometimes this is not the case. Sometimes the values of your organization are incongruent with what you believe personally, but hopefully there's some crossover. Consult with your peers or other individuals in the industry who may have experience in similar situations. This is important because networking and networks are very important, are fundamental within sport management, and people who work in similar contexts can be an invaluable source of knowledge and advice. So when I worked for the Arizona Coyotes underneath their general counsel, I had several colleagues that were in similar organizations in similar roles that I could reach out to ask their opinion or get their feedback about an issue at hand. So certainly very powerful resource. List your options. So list out your options so you're informed. Look for a win-win situation if at all possible. This step and suggestion is very similar to many negotiation strategies where you're trying to please both parties. So you're trying to meet both parties' needs. So that's an overall positive result. So here, for example, the NBA very well might have tried to work with the Carolina legislature to try to change the language of that law that met the needs of both the state legislatures as well as the NBA. Who knows? 8, ask yourself this question: how would my family feel if my decision and how I arrived at my decision appeared on the internet tomorrow? Again, your honest reaction and feedback usually is very telling in terms of whether or not the correct decision was arrived at. 9, sleep on it. Don't rush a decision. Again, this is sort of like advice that is for the street. It is something that just makes sense. What you don't want to make a snap decision. You want to make sure it's well measured, and you want to make sure that you're coming to the right decision, maybe after gaining feedback. 10, make your best decision, knowing it may not be perfect. Again, going back to the decision-making process from managerial aspects of sport management, you're going to not always be able to please everybody. And it's not about whether or not you make the decision you want, but instead the decision that you can make under the circumstances, the most possible, most feasible decision. So of course the NBA did not want to leave North Carolina because it could result in burnt bridges, upset fans. It would be additional costs. Perhaps there's contracts that would be violated. But knowing what is the most feasible under the circumstances and pursuant to the guiding foundational policies of your organization, whether it's a code of conduct or a mission statement and the like, you need to make that decision that makes the most sense, although it might not be perfect. And then also within managing, you need to be evaluating your decision in terms of managerial decisions. Always be evaluating your decision, trying to learn the most so that you can make better decisions in the future. The textbook references codes of conduct. So codes of conduct are usually a overriding statement that is a philosophy concerning the organization's beliefs as well as its ethics. And it exists so that the ethical compass of the organization is well established. It also helps with trying to compare, or when you're solving issues or making decisions, an organization can consult the code of conduct so that the organization can determine whether or not the code of conduct is met based off of how the decision is being made. It also might outline and explain the principles under which an organization operates, and these codes of conduct should be straightforward. They should not be very convoluted and it's more should provide a baseline level of understanding. You can create an effective code of conduct by making sure that the code is concrete. It's not too vague. Less is more. Make sure that the overriding principles are infused into the code of conduct in terms of the ethics of the organization and the foundational beliefs, so that it can be used in a variety of circumstances when concerning foundational dilemmas. And the code of conduct should also immediately identify who is bound by it, who it affects. And finally, codes of conduct should contain consequences. So let's take a look at a code of conduct here. So we've got Bates College Code of Ethics, which is similar to a code of conduct. It lays out the purpose. It shows that it applies to NCAA athletes. You've got some definitions here, violations of the code. So you've got the code. Bates College supports a prominent NCAA or Division III NCAA intercollegiate program. Your representation of the college involving public exposure in a competitive area and the meeting makes you one of the most visible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A position that requires exemplary conduct, your behavior has a most definite impact on the reputation of, okay, lastly, you are not to choose. You will be looked up as the role of a leader. So the code applies to everyone at Bates College. Violations of the code. We've got an appeal. But it's fairly straightforward and short and to the point. All right. It's also important to distinguish the concept of morality. So when you're talking about ethical dilemmas, oftentimes it's couched in the context of right and wrong, that there's two opposite choices. Is it right or wrong to require genetic testing for people who want to compete in an event because you want to make sure that they are of that gender that they claim to be? Social practices depend on people upholding certain baseline values. So, is it moral? Is the morality to make sure that everyone is the gender they say they are, or is the moral? Is the proper morality aspect here that you want to prevent people from being subject to the embarrassing test and scrutiny that confirming their gender could be invasive. It could be embarrassing. Social practices depend on upholding certain baseline values of that society. And morals are seen as coming from a higher order or common sense. So, again, this is important in the aspect that it's supposed to reflect society, that the higher order of society. And like we said, many moral values in society are codified by laws, but moral behavior cannot always be legislated, and people cannot be forced to act morally. So going back, the laws provide a baseline level of obligation, but we as a society want to strive to a higher standard, but we can't force people to do that. Within the workplace, there's also ethical considerations, and the text makes this distinction between absolutism and relativism. So absolutism says that moral precepts are universal, applicable to all circumstances. So morality should never waver. It should stay the same according to absolutism. So what is moral in one context and what someone should do in one context is not going to change. It's the same. However, everything is relative, says relativism. What is moral depends on the situation. So I'm curious to know what you folks believe, if you want to put that in part of your post. Commercial moral rules, that's also very interesting, versus non-commercial moral rules. The text goes out of its way to distinguish the two different roles within sport management, saying that sometimes in the marketplace you have commercial activities where you're trying to sell something or market something, and you might be a little bit lax with the truth, trying to sell tickets or sell the team. So where does morality go with that in terms of being honest and not puffing, not using puffery? Non-commercial moral rules say that the occupation demands loyalty to its oath of office or professional standards to guard against selling out. So that means that you're going to stay with your morals and be honest regardless of the context. Specific jobs in sports do not reside completely in either commercial or non-commercial sphere. That's true. We as sport managers or working in the sport or recreation industry oftentimes have shifting roles and different hats. So the question becomes, does the athletic trainer or does the head trainer or the doctor, knowing that the coach wants that player to not miss any time with their injury, is that trainer going to try to cut corners and getting that player rehabbed and on the field that could result in some long-term consequences possibly down the way? Or does the coach fib about the status of a player in terms of health in order to throw off the other team? Or what sort of truthfulness does the sport manager have about how good a team is going to be, or the value, or the whether or not the price that's on sale is the absolute lowest price that the ticket's going to be all season? So the process of making a moral choice and deciding whether or not something is right or wrong is dependent upon the context and what parameters are acceptable within the context of the person's role in that organization or in society. However, this is a slippery slope because immoral behavior could violate basic assumptions about society and its institutions. This goes back to performance-enhancing drugs within sport. If we're looking at the absolute goal being to win, like we saw with Russia during the 2014 Olympics, Winter Olympics in Sochi, is the absolute goal to bring home as many gold medals as possible for your country, which they certainly did. I believe they led the Winter Olympics in gold medals. At what cost is that going to be at? Certainly, performance-enhancing drugs are, to a certain extent, is not a crime, taking them, but they certainly are punishable at the International Olympic Committee level, all the way down to the state and regional federations. So looking at context can potentially lead to immoral behavior, and then that would potentially lead to corruption, which is in reference to the relativism. So once that relativism in terms of ethics is systematic within the entire organization, that really is a breeding ground for potential corruption. So us as sport managers and people working within sport or the recreation field need to understand that as we continue to evolve as a society and people and organizations come up with innovations, that can lead to new ethical dilemmas. From a society aspect, the ethical dilemma of self-driving cars, the dangers of all of that, or genomic testing, genomic breeding, allowing people to selectively allowing parents to, in a sense, have a greater say in the genes of their unborn child and to select out any potential harmful genes. What are the consequences of that? So what is moral and what is ethical really does evolve over time. So sport managers, in summary, need to be aware of the importance that morality and ethics play, not only in the workplace, but in society as a whole. And your decisions, whether it's wearing the hat of a sport manager or a trainer or a parent or someone who's a Little League coach, is going to affect people regardless of who they are, of what hat they're wearing. So incorporating from a business perspective or an organizational standpoint, incorporating codes of ethics, things like self-examinations and forums to discuss issues of ethical importance that the text talks about, and having consequences for violations of ethics will help to ensure that sport managers, their employees, and society as a whole make the right decisions. So I encourage you to post about this and continue the conversation online and with your classmates, because this is a topic that is going to continue to give us examples virtually every day. We've barely scratched the surface, but that means that there's more to talk about. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I will be seeing you folks soon.